If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. So he says, you're running a trade deficit. Look, they're all cheating me. But all that's happening is the United States is outspending its national income. And you can look at the national income chart. You can add up consumption and investment and government spending, and you could subtract off gross national product, and lo and behold, what will that equal? Not approximately, exactly. That will equal the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much you spend on goods and services versus how much you sell in goods and services. So the United States runs a current account deficit because it spends more than it produces. Why does it do that? We have a big credit card in the United States. It's called the national government. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says, spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No, it got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses.
Hello, brothers and sisters. How are you doing? I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Tech Stories. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you an important video that Jeffrey Sachs, as an American political analyst and also an economist, that brings an important message in the front of the table so that we as people, we can see this. And especially this video is so much important to the citizens of the United States because you need to know what is really happening. I like the fact that it tries to describe Trump as one-man circus. And in this, it was trying to highlight the transformation of the US presidency from an institutional-based role into a personality-driven performance. In a functioning democracy, A president operates within a network of advisors, institutions, and checks and balances that guides policy. Well, in this case, Trump, however, treated the presidency as his personal stage, relying heavily on media theatrics, social media dominance, and rallies designed to excite his base rather than substantive policymaking. This constant focus on self promotion, which has created an environment where decisions were often made impulsively for the public relations, um, for their public relations impact rather than careful, informed deliberation. Well, I'm hoping that you're great from wherever you're watching me from. And I would really love us to watch this video because what Jeffrey Sachs really shares, it's a couple of things like other professors like Chris Ages, other professors like Parenti, other professors like Richard DeWolf have always tried to bring forefront in the table. But what's so much different about Jeffrey Sachs? Jeffrey Sachs has his own takedown on Donald Trump issue. And I think this video really serves you well. So I want us to take our time and watch this video. And I'm asking you, this is just a plea. If you're watching me for the first time, or maybe you've been watching my videos, still haven't earned your trust, well, I'm asking you, kindly, please subscribe to the channel, join the membership, so that you don't regret missing out when I post or upload a new content. But until then, I want us to watch this video. I'll be back with my commentary, and also let me know what you think about these in the comment section. These topics, these discussions, I really found them so much important, so much educative for making the Americans understand who is really ruling them, who is really behind all these chaotic things that are happening today in the United States. So buckle up for this video. I'll be back with my commentary as usual.
It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the US went up and they went down. No, everybody went down because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors, Elon Musk, who paid for his election, became prime minister, he said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt.
The safest thing in the world, apparently.
So interesting what happened. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%
where he
on some
raised
products.
the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. Now, it raises, if I could, just one last point. How can this happen when it makes no sense? And that, people should understand, we are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing. You raise one final interesting issue, which is that the market recovered about $4 trillion when he reversed. Anyone who knew that 5 minutes before made billions. This is not the cleanest government in the world, I can tell you. I'd be hugely surprised if some people didn't know just a bit ahead of time, starting with members of the U.S. Congress, by the way.
Look, we'll get into the more general issues about protectionism and the end of globalization in a minute, but I think what's happening and the directives coming from the White House are such a perfect example of what this panel is about. I'd just like to stay on this just for a few more minutes. Minister, is protectionism always a short-term aim, and does it always come at the expense of the longer-term gain? Donald Trump hasn't said it in public, but apparently in private, during his first term, he was asked about the problem of the U.S. national debt. And his answer was, I don't care because I'll be dead by the time it's a problem. And apparently that's also his approach to the climate crisis. So is this protectionism coming from the White House a short-term fix which is going to hurt America in the longer term in terms of how it grows?
It's not a fix. It's apparently a quick fix, but it's fundamentally flawed, as Professor has very clearly stated. Look, protectionism is nothing new. If you look at post-global financial crisis, the number of annual trade restrictions have gone up dramatically. In fact, like last year, there were over 3,200 trade restrictions. That is almost 11 times higher than what it was pre-global financial crisis. So this has been a trend, but what we have seen over the past week or two is clearly a new level. This goes beyond some protectionist measures, trade restrictions. This goes into something, an all-out trade war. So that's really worrisome, because if you go back, again, if you look at 20 years to global financial crisis, global annual trade growth was 2 times world real GDP growth rate. So in a way, trade was the engine of growth. Mm-hmm. Now that engine has been slow. So if you look at post-global financial crisis, global trade growth barely kept up kept up with real GDP, global GDP growth. So that's no longer really one of the kind of like a strong engine. But I think the way things are now, if current state of affairs is sustained, we may end up actually protectionism dragging global growth. It is not only growth, it's really, there are many, additional fallouts from this type of policies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So the answer to your question, this is not a fix. This is a fundamentally flawed, policy perspective. Obviously, countries have choice. They always have a choice. But we would rather, see world moving back to rule-based, multilateral framework, where everyone benefits. I think I agree with Professor. Over 1 billion people since 1990s have been lifted out of poverty, predominantly in Asia. I'm talking about absolute poverty here. And that's largely thanks to, trade and growth associated with that trade. So it is worrisome that we are now experimenting policies that may actually reverse some of these gains, which I think were very important. 1 billion people out of absolute poverty cannot be underestimated. It's quite significant. Now, admittedly, trade do cause geographic dislocations, but the solution is not protectionism. The solution lies more internal sound policies, structural remedies, but also you can deploy tax policy incentives and other things to address, dislocations in regions caused by, global trade openness. So it's not a level, but protectionism will create more inequalities. It will create bigger problems. Already you've got significant headwinds for global growth. Aging population, high global indebtedness, impending climate crisis. So protectionism is going to be yet another big blow to long-term growth outlook. And that's why growth is barely, sustained at 3%. I think the risk is that we will move to a new era where per capita GDP growth will almost disappear if we continue down this path.
Really interesting what you say about protectionism having fallout in other sectors, and we will get on to that, about how it might affect cooperation on the climate crisis, global health, et cetera, But let's use one country as a particular example about how a nation can react to protectionism. So we have the US tariffs, which in 90 days will come into effect beyond the 10% that Donald Trump has placed. Let's take two rich countries. UK and Singapore will stay at 10%. Bangladesh and Botswana will both go up to 37%. Laos will be 48%. Syria will be 41%. Lesotho in southern Africa will be 50%. In 2023, the US exported to Lesotho $7.33 million worth of goods. Lesotho in that same year exported to the United States $228 million. The US GDP per capita in 2023 was $82.8 thousand per person. In Lesotho, it was $916. Gentlemen, how does a country like Lesotho deal with the protectionism coming from the US? Minister? Well,
look, protectionism is an external shock, meaning it's not a decision by, the counterparty. It's essentially, so how do you deal with it? I guess you focus on regional integration, as an antidote of protectionism. So regional connectivity, regional integration would be one way forward. So, instead of globalization on a big scale, you focus on how you can deepen and broaden your ties with your immediate neighborhood, or countries that are still willing to entertain rule-based trade. So I think that's the only way. Again, this is a major shock for many countries. I think global supply chains are going to suffer. This will lead to, I mean, already, I think the risk is that capital will be misallocated. Take us, I mean, take Turkey, for example. We are the world's second largest of white goods exporter. We need chips, basic ones, nothing sophisticated. We're not talking about 4 nanometers. We're talking about 30, 40, 70 nanometers. If we're worried that countries are not going to supply that, even though it may not be the most efficient way, we may have to go into a very large capex to see if we could produce them. We are good at something. Other countries are better at something. So we would rather trade. And this is a very simple, economics, theory. Everybody benefits. So I don't think, X country or Y country, there's not much they can do except to look at, ways in which they could mitigate the fallout from not being able to sell goods to the United States.
But Professor, that takes a long time to arrange because, of course, the shock is immediate. You can't make deals that quickly, can you?
I think the particular tariff rates that Trump announced last week that led to that financial bloodbath are not going to come back. So I don't think we're going to hear again about those numbers after 90 days. 90 days in U.S. time now is infinity. It's eternity. We'll never hear those numbers again. Where did those numbers come from? Something, again, so stupid you can't believe that any country would do this. But the idea is the following. As I said, if you want to know what your trade balance is, you earn some income, so you sell some services to somebody, and you buy things. And if you spend what you earn, you're in trade balance. Technically, you're in current account balance. Now, most of us, I work for one employer, my university, so I run a big trade surplus with my university. And then I run a pretty big trade deficit with the grocery store that we buy our groceries from, and if I have to buy shoes, I run a trade deficit with the shoe store, and so forth. Trump's idea, just to add to the craziness of it, is that you should run a trade balance with everybody, not an overall trade balance, but a trade balance with everybody. So you should sell a little bit, you should work a little bit for your shoe store, you should work a little bit for your grocery store, you should go around anytime you want to shop, you trade something. I'll write you an essay if you'll sell me shoes, and you make your living somehow trying to balance your trade with all of your counterparts. Well, this is insane. This is why we have a market economy. You don't have to have balance with every transaction that you do with somebody. But what Trump said was, oh, Lesotho, they sell us more than we buy from them. So they're cheating us. That's literally what he said. Literally what he said. Okay, is it completely delusional or rhetoric? It's delusional, okay? Just so you know. It's weird. But anyway, now, then he calculated a formula. Okay, Lesotho, we have to tax them by the amount to reduce the imports from them so that we have balance with Lesotho. And then they made some absolutely stupid formula that you would not accept in a first year, third week class. It came out of the U.S. Trade Representative's office. They probably were told, do it overnight, the boss wants it. And then they came up with a list of tariffs, country by country, based on the bilateral trade balance. You cannot make this stuff up. This is not it used to be not a Mickey Mouse country, my country. But this is Mickey Mouse. This is not, and I'm sorry, I apologize to Mickey Mouse. He would not do this. Mickey Mouse is smarter than this. So we are in a crazy land, actually, with this. Now, it stopped for a moment. We'll never hear those numbers again. I don't know what we'll hear in 3 months. God help us, really. Because it probably won't have to do with trade. It'll have to do with something else. But we can't normalize this as what's the rationale, how to negotiate, what to do. Of course, 60 countries immediately said, we'll rebalance with you. And the President of the United States literally used the language I'm about to use. I'm quoting him because otherwise I would never say this. He said, 60 countries are coming to kiss my ass. He said that in a public speech, the President of the United States. So this is, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No,
but it's presidential language.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm only speaking at high political terms. So we cannot normalize this. We have to say no. We didn't spend 100 years on 200 years, 207 years since David Ricardo put forward the idea of comparative advantage, okay? And we have been building the trade system since the ruins of World War II for 80 years. And we have been building the World Trade Organization, which the US led the creation of, I think it's fair to say, for 31 years. This should not be normalized to try to figure out what is the theory of this. And it's a more fundamental point, ladies and gentlemen. The United States is a rogue nation right now on many things, not just on trade, but on making Gaza into the US Riviera, on whatever it wants to say. It's a little bit of a rogue nation. For the world to hold together, the rest of the world has to say, we're not going down crazy lane. We're going to be responsible. We're going to go to the UN. We're going to go to the World Trade Organization. We're not going to get into this downward spiral. Because if we normalize craziness, there is no way out.
You mentioned Mickey Mouse, but there's a kind of a theme here from Bloomberg, the news agency. These are its headlines in the morning and the afternoon of Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Tuesday morning, this is madness. In the afternoon, a clown show. On Wednesday, stocks keep falling. In the afternoon, could have been worse. Thursday morning, assessing the damage. Thursday afternoon, Trump blinks.
Minister, and by the way, if
yeah.
I may, because it's interesting, because I'm living in this crazy world, the Secretary of Treasury then, with all deference to a person who has a very hard job, he says, this was planned all along when Trump dropped this. Can you imagine?
He couldn't say anything else, though.
Well, yeah, I know, but to hear this from your Treasury Secretary is not also reassuring, because all you hear is a crazy land rather than what we need to hear, which is rationality.
Okay, so let's make it more general for the moment. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I'll give you a few minutes at the end if you want to ask our two panelists a question. We'll try to get a few questions in from the audience. So to broaden it out, Minister, as the professor says, and pretty much everybody agrees, protectionism doesn't make economic sense, because in the longer term, it's going to cost everybody. So what's driving increasing protectionism, not just in the United States, but in other nations as well? Because if it doesn't make economic sense, does it mean it then becomes a political statement from the person imposing that protectionism to almost appear as like a nationalist moment to bring people towards that decision maker politically rather than economically?
Well, it's easy to explain. I think what is driving the current what seems like a fundamentally flawed policies is, first of all, let's set the scene. I mean, there's a geostrategic competition between China and the United States. We know that. China has what it takes to become a superpower because it has human capital, it has state-of-art infrastructure, and now it's catching up in technology. United States consider itself as the hegemon power. So we know from history there's always been tensions between existing superpowers and emerging ones. It doesn't have to end this way, meaning in a trade war or any other wars, but it does in the past. I mean, history tells us that we more frequently see tensions rather than cooperation. So what lies behind this? Very simple. Go back to 20 years ago, roughly speaking. China accounts for about 8% of global manufacturing. Today, China accounts for more than 30% of global manufacturing. Who lost ground? United States, European Union, and Japan. United States clearly also sees this. Again, go back to 20 years ago and just visualize a world map. Which country commands as the main trading partner of the rest of the world? Maps are all over the place. Clearly, it was the United States 20 years ago. Today, it's China. Now, normally, the way you would respond, the way I would respond, is that, look, we need sound policies, structural reforms to regain ground. Instead, it looks like this rivalry, combined with lack of, obviously, clear understanding, is that it leads you to go after quick fixes. And quick fixes, which is also to do with populism, nationalism, is to blame others and is to present it in a simple fashion. The reality is you have to be more competitive. You have to invest in upskilling, reskilling your population. You have to invest in your infrastructure. And you have to, there's a long list of homework. But those are politically difficult to deliver. They take time, and they're difficult. So structural policy has been lacking in most countries. And when you can't deliver structural transformation, then you rely on monetary policy to fix things. Monetary policy in many parts of the developed world have been doing the heavy lifting over the last couple of decades in the face of difficulties. So my point here is that I think we know what drives it is losing ground. But how do you regain ground? Again, the sophisticated way would be to do the right thing and deliver on reforms. The easy way would be to blame everyone else and come up with high tariffs as a fix.
Let's see. Okay, so protectionism is also not helping your friends to concentrate more on yourself rather than the outside world. We know that the drastic cuts to USAID, the Agency for International Development, has already or is going to cost lives. Myanmar's recent earthquake, the Americans have been for decades maybe the most important first responder, sending hundreds of rescue workers. They sent 3 administrators. They didn't send a single rescue worker. They laid off recently some people working for the federal government on the US nuclear program. They realized very quickly within a couple of days that it was actually a national security issue, so they were told to come back to their office. The office said, sorry, they've been excluded from their federal emails, so we can't get in touch with them. So they couldn't re-employ them. Professor Sachs, when you were president of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, it focuses, I've got to read this from the notes, it focuses on sustainable development, this institute at Columbia, including research in climate change, geology, global health, economics, management, agriculture, ecosystems, urbanization, energy, water, everything that we need to live. So how does protectionism affect these kinds of relationships between one country and another country?
Yeah,
It's actually
I want to answer
deglobalization.
that by continuing on with the brilliant.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great, doing fine from wherever you're watching me from. One common thing that stands out through all these professors that I've had them talk about Mr. Donald Trump, currently the president of the United States, is that Mr. Donald Trump makes decisions without institutional input. And in fact, he doesn't follow the laws, the precedents that were placed, that govern, that rule the United States, and that makes sure everything is in control, because there is no impunity for the president, because he can also be held accountable when he does some wrong choice. But Mr. Donald Trump doesn't want to be held accountable. Now, such has long argued that effective governance depends on structured decision-making, consulting experts, weighing long-term consequences, and considering diverse perspectives. Trump consistently bypassed these processes, sidelining agencies, ignoring professional advice, and replacing experts without loyalists who would validate his instincts. This has weakened the institutional capacity of the US government, leaving it less prepared to respond to crisis. In such high, this was not just a bad leadership. It was actively dismantling the structure of governance, replacing it with a leadership style driven entirely by a one man's whims. Talking about economic policy built on oversimplifications, a major target of such criticism was Trump's economic thinking, particularly in trade policy. And you've heard it. Trump framed complex issues like trade deficits in simplistic zero-sum terms, blaming China, Mexico, or the EU for the US economic challenges. Sachs also pointed out that these arguments ignored the real structural causes of job losses, such as automation and corporate outsourcing decisions driven by profit, not foreign competition alone, but by pushing economically unsound tariff policies. Trump destabilized global trade, which Sachs estimated contributed to trillions in lost wealth globally. Now, for this, Sachs was a clear example of how personal political theater, being tough on foreign nation, trumped coherently economic planning. Also, talking about the tariff war as self-inflicted harm, Sachs saw the US-China trade war not as a strategic economic maneuver, but as a politically motivated stand that harmed both economies. Trump's tariff triggered retaliatory tariffs from China, which hit American farmers and manufacturers hard. Billions in taxpayers-funded subsidies had to be distributed to struggling farmers to offset these losses. Sachs argued that this was draining America economically. Taxpayers' money was being spent to fix problems that were entirely self-created, undermining the president's promise to make America great again. Also, talking about the crisis governance and the COVID-19 as our perfect example. Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, in such view, epitomized the failure of a one-man circus presidency rather than organizing a coordinated national response grounded in science. Trump often contradicted health experts, spread misinformation, and downplayed the severity of the virus. This political theater, dismissing the pandemic to protect its public image, has costed the US both lives and credibility. Such public called Trump COVID-19 response as catastrophic and the worst leadership I have ever seen in my lifetime, seeing it as a case where personality-driven governance directly led to national tragedy. Also, talking about draining America's institutional strength, while Trump promised to drain the swamp, implying he will remove corruption and inefficiency, such argued that he instead drained the U.S. of institutional expertise. Career civil servants were sidelined or replaced by political loyalists. Scientific agencies were undermined, and diplomatic corps staffing was hollowed out. This hollowing out left America so weaker, less able to respond to complex challenges, and more on Trump's personal decision making. In such framework, this wasn't swamp draining, it was institutional sabotage. Talking about the blurring of governance and entertainment, Trump's presidency, such suggested, blurred the line between governance and entertainment. Theatrics became policy. Decisions were often made based on capacity to dominate headlines rather than their effectiveness in addressing the real problems. This circus approach, such belief, eroded the seriousness of the presidency itself. When the focus is generating applause lines at rallies rather than implementing policies that work, the nation is left with spectacle instead of substance, a costly trade-off in both economic and moral terms. Also, talk about the cult of personality and authoritarian drift. The one-man circus also points to Trump's cultivation of personality cult. Remember, by framing himself as a singular savior of the nation, Trump encouraged loyalty to himself rather than the Constitution or democratic principles. Such warned that this centralization of loyalty weakened democracy and pushes the country towards authoritarianism. The health and the republic depends on respect of the institutions, not blind allegiance to one leader. Yet, Trump's political style encouraged exactly that allegiance. Talking about international reputation damage, and this is true. Such frequently emphasize that Trump's behavior on the world stage damaged America's credibility. Abrupt withdrawals from international agreements, public insults directed at allied leaders, and erratic shifts in foreign policy created an image of the U.S. as unreliable and unpredictable. This reduced America's ability to build stable partnerships, undermining decades of diplomatic capital. Such consider this another form of draining America, draining its global standing and soft power. Another thing that I like to address is economic drain through misaligned priorities. Domestically, Such criticized Trump for prioritizing corporate tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy rather than investing in infrastructure, in education, or healthcare. This worsened inequality without significantly boosting allies, without significantly long-term growth. By focusing on policies that rewarded his political allies and donors base, Trump diverted resources from foundational investments America needed. Such saw this as a short-term political gain at the cost of long-term national strength. Also, talking about the erosion of public trust, and this is also true, right? Perhaps most damaging such view was the erosion of the public trust in government. Trump's constant attacks on the press, the judiciary, and the intelligence community fostered a widespread cynicism about democratic institutions. When people lose faith in institutions that hold society together, governance becomes harder, polarization deepens, and democracy weakens. This, such argued, is one of the most dangerous legacies that of Trump's presidency. A nation less united and more distrustful of itself. Another question is that why such circus metaphor resonates today. By calling Trump's presidency as one-man circus, such encapsulated all these points. Governance replaced with ego-driven spectacle, economic policy driven by slogans rather than substance, institutional decay disguised as a reform, and a dangerous concentration of political loyalty in one man. To such, this was not a presidency serving nationals long term, it was a performance that drained America's economic strength, democratic institution, and global credibility. The circus, a metaphor stuck because it captured the chaotic, unpredictable, and personality-centered nature of Trump's tenure. And the cost of letting politics become a show rather than a service. Guys, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories. If you're watching me for the first time again, this is just a simple plea. I'll ask you to kindly subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get to see what I can offer you. But until then, let me see you on my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.